welcome back to FHN. Me and the Barnum are here in the bait lab. Dude, we're going to talk a little bit about Willapa.
Home waters.
For you, especially, and one that I've actually, made an effort to show up on the last couple of years and have found moderate success for, again, anytime you take on a new fishery and need to learn it, there's some things that apply, that cross over. We're going to talk about gear that's very applicable to what's going on in Buoy 10 right now.
Right.
If you're out in Puget Sound fishing coho, this is something that people actually do with lead droppers and inline fish flash. So there's a lot of things here that are applicable to other fisheries. The biggest point of contention in Willapa, the biggest frustration is the damn grass.
Right. So the thing people have to understand about Willapa, it is one of the largest oyster producers in the world. I think it's 1 in every 6 oysters in the world consumed comes out of Willapa.
Yeah.
So the grass that you have is from the mechanical harvesting and the mechanical maintaining of those oysters. Eel grass grows in the oyster beds.
Sure.
The oyster farmers go out there, they drag harrows, they drag their dredge bags, and they rip all that grass out.
Right.
And so that grass ends up, what's it do? It goes out into the bay, and then on your tides, basically, during your slack waters, it tends to spread out, and during your better tides or during your ebb and your flood, it seams up and gets on those seams. And when it's on the seams, it's super easy to deal with.
You
avoid it.
You're right.
Right.
You see an island of grass floating that's like a mile long, you just steer clear of it.
And some of those islands, I mean, you think you could get out and walk on.
Oh my God.
I mean, literally, if you screw up and get your gear through it, I mean, you have trouble retrieving your gear because it pulls so hard.
Do you think the grass is harder to fish if we have a really moderate to minimal tide? In other words, it doesn't really flood in or flow out. It doesn't have a lot of water moving, so that grass just kind of stays everywhere. Or you know what I mean?
For me, I think the one thing I've noticed when I really struggle with grass is when there's wind.
Right.
The wind starts to push that grass and spread it out off of those seam currents, and that's when I tend to have more trouble with grass and get really frustrated with grass.
Right.
So the important thing to remember when fishing Willapa, because of the grass, it's not like, oh, I had a day where there's no grass. No, every day is going to have grass.
You can't avoid it.
And realistically, the difference between the guys that are consistently catching fish and the guys that aren't catching fish are the guys that are willing to put in the work to keep their gear clean, to make sure they're presenting how the fish flash and the bait is meant to be presented. I always tell everybody, whether you're fishing grass or not, if you always let that bait down into the water a little bit, see the action of your plug cut herring or your super bait or whatever you're running, see how it's working. If it's not working to your standards, pull it out and fix it. Maybe toss it and cut a new bait if you can't get to work. Don't fish a bait that's not fishing.
If you can see before you put it out, you're just you're not fishing.
Right. And so for me,
or when you're dropping that down in and you're trolling along and you're watching your herring spin and all of a sudden it gets a couple or 2 pieces of grass hanging in front of it, and you're like, good enough. That herring is not going to get bit with grass draped on it that you saw before you send it down. So clean gear, clean bait, good spin, and then it's a battle of constantly keeping your gear clean by checking it. Talk us through your process.
Here's my routine for Willapa. Normally, because of the 2-rod endorsement, my youngest son, I'll get the 2-rod endorsement, he'll get the 2-rod. So even if it's only 2 of us, we're fishing 4 rods. And so basically what we do is somebody goes designated driver, and they're going to drive the boat. And whoever's working the rods, if I have more people in the back, great, because it is exhausting.
Oh my God.
But by the time I'll start rod number 1, get it out, make sure it's fishing good, get it in the rod holder, and work my way through 4 or maybe 5 rods. And then immediately upon finishing that 4th or 5th rod, I go back to my first rod and I crank it up and check it out. Now, if I'm seeing grass on that rod, even though it's only been in the water for 5 to 10 minutes, then I'm going to clean that rod, put it back, and go to rod number 2. And I'm going to start a rotation. And I'm going to continue that rotation on the entire trip until I start reeling in and noticing no grass. And then at that point, I'll give it a little longer.
And you're right, it's exhausting, it's a lot of work, but if you're trolling and you're not cleaning grass and running clean gear, you're trolling. You're not fishing, right?
And the other thing is, like we've talked about before, I'm a line angle guy. I'm going to set my speed depending on my current. I'm going to keep my line angles at, say, 45 degrees or whatever angle. And if I notice any rod is no longer at that angle and the other 2 or 3 rods that I'm fishing are at that angle, then I know that rod's fouled up and I need to clean it up.
Typically, it's going to lift and be at a steeper angle, longer out the back, and it's not at depth, and it's not rotating like it should.
Yes.
Talk about your typical setup,
right?
Of what you use out there, Harbor Boy and all.
So we and Dwayne talked about this before. He's going to show you some of the more kind of, I want to call it high-end fancy gear. and we only say that in Willapa because coming from a small community, small area, limited resources, we don't have a Cabela's, a Sportco, these places where we can go and get all the latest and greatest. So we're stuck basically trying to buy what the hardware store is going to supply.
Yeah.
So for me, I'm running braided. I'm running a 50-pound mainline braid. This is just, I actually think it's a splitter or spreader, whatever you want to call it. I actually think it's made for probably halibut fishing.
Right.
But that's what I use, and that'll go here. And then I'm just using Dacron on my dropper, and I'm using that as my line between my flasher and my spreader. Now, Dwayne, you're going to talk about more going into the monofilament, but for me growing up and all the years I spent, they don't sell 150-pound monofilament in Raymond.
Not the hardware store.
Right. So we've went to Dacron. I'm going to run that off this clip here. I always run 16 ounces, but Willapa is definitely a fishery where I'm rarely fishing over 24 feet deep, maybe 28 feet at the most.
Shallow water fishery.
Shallow water fishery. The estuary is very shallow to begin with, but even on those lines where, even like, let's talk about Washaway. At points in Washaway, it's 100 feet deep.
Right.
Those fish will tend to stay on the edges of those channels and kind of stay in that 24 to 28 foot line, and that's where I want to be. And so I'm running a 12 to 14, 16 inch dropper, and most of the time, I'm going to want to touch this on the bottom every now and then. And that's the point of the dropper, is that's going to give me a dropper on the bottom and my bait and flasher 18 inches off the bottom.
Right.
So when I drag bottom, I'm dragging bottom here, and I'm not dragging my bait on the bottom, which is going to keep me from ripping my herring off. And so basically for me on say 90% of the Willapa fishery, if I haven't seen that rod touch bottom in say a minute or two, then I need to let out some line. And I'm going to let out some line, see bottom touch, half a crank up. That way I know this is running, 6 to 8 inches off of bottom, and anytime there's a little hump, I'm going to see that little bounce. So, and that's the basic tactic off that. And then we're going to run about a 3.5 foot leader with a mooching rig and, a plug cut herring for the most part. Once in a while I'll mix that up with a whole herring. Just something different if the bite's slow.
It's a bait fishery. It's not a spinner fishery. I mean, you're just going to grab grass. So bait works so well out there, you don't want to use anything else. And I'll often, I'll have natural shiners brined up, and I'll bring some green or some chartreuse too, because the water's a little stained. It's not a clean running estuary. It's like most estuaries that are truly shallow estuaries. There's a lot of silt that gets stirred up,
A lot of silt.
So especially on these bigger tides, when that water's pushing, it churns that stuff up. Plus you got the oyster guys doing their thing. And that water all filters into that entire estuary, and it is stained up pretty well. So, bright UVs on your flashers, greens and chartreuses, and you've had good success.
Really good on this one. This is a new one I picked up last year, and it's been really effective to a point to where now I'm running a couple of those. Where usually I'm kind of where, let's mix our flashers and have 3-4 different colors running, but
if it's getting it done. Somebody was asking earlier if you run 360s out there. Not typically, because there's so much grass. The larger profile of loop and rotation your gear is presenting, the more grass you're going to encounter. If you're more directly behind the boat, which is like parting the seas at times and clearing some of that out, the back rods tend to fish a little cleaner than your side rods. That's almost a no-brainer because the boat is pushing the grass out of the way. If you want to try to deploy a 360 rotator out there, more power to you, but I just won't even give it a go, simply because it's not that it wouldn't. If there was no grass, it'd work fantastic, especially with the light penetration and the shallowness of the bay, right? But
one thing to remember with the grass cleaning that I sometimes forget because I get in a hurry, but as you're doing your rotation, always clean your front rods first. Because you're going to clean that and you're throwing that grass overboard. And I've done it myself where I just cleaned a back rod, now I pull the front rod and I throw the grass out and throw it right into the line on the back rod and go,
stupid. So only a couple differences here in this yuppie world we live in, and all this high-end fluent gear that I apparently purchased, So I do like to use the Yakima bait spreader bar as far as the way I rig my dropper. They came out with this a few years ago. It's nice because it slides, or you can make it fixed, either or. I basically put that in front of a couple beads to a chain swivel that then goes to my jumper. Now, I build these jumpers out of my 150-pound monofilament. I put clips on either side with barrel swivels and clamp those together with my crimp on that I use for my flashers, right? Same deal. And I make them 2 specific lengths, okay? I will actually make the jumper that goes between my flasher, make sure I don't get this screwed up, my flasher and my slider. That is a 20-inch piece right there, okay, if you can see that. And then the actual dropper is typically 16 inches. And the whole reason to go heavier gauge on this stuff, 1, is that you're going to make sure you're not losing gear. 2, it really helps with a stiffer line like this, bigger diameter, or the Dacron, from your gear getting all balled up and twisted up. When you get grass that builds up on these swivels and they no longer swivel, something has to spin. And when something has to spin and all your bearings and swivels are locked up by grass, your line begins to spin and twist. And the smaller diameter this stuff is, the bigger mess and headache you end up with. And it's a lot easier to disconnect all this stuff. Everything is modular. It all terminates with dual snaps or dual locks, okay? So you can pop these swivels off everything, you can disconnect and do all this without having to cut a bunch of line unless your braided line really gets balled up. But typically, because of the way we design this with a heavier gauge dropper, and out there, it's pretty much a mud bottom all the time. You seldom, if ever, get hung up.
No,
right?
Hardly
but
ever.
if you do, I do build into my breaking point on my lead, and I'll show you here. It's a very small size dual lock that if there's going to be a failure point on any of this, it's not going to be the 150 pound. It's not going to be these 300 pound freaking barrel swivels. It's going to be this little dual lock is going to just pull right out of there, and that weight's going to be left on the bottom, and you get all your gear back. So that's my breaking point if in fact it was to get hooked up. The other thing I like to do, a friend of mine a few years ago started showing me toothpicking out in front of your gear. And I've taken that and built it up a little bigger in that I take a regular size skewer, okay, and Barnum, I'm cutting those into about 2 3/4 of an inch. You get about 4 of them per stick, and simply by sliding a swivel up your line, and then you pin this peg through the swivel eye, and that just holds in place. Now that is the first thing that is getting drug out in front of all your gear, okay? So I'll show that out front here, David, if we can not get all balled up. So that is out in front of my slider, just like that. Now, that is not meant to just grab a salad bar and just keep trolling, right? That is simply meant to avoid getting all the grass down into your swivels and everything that's turning, okay? You can or choose not to use this, but for me, I've gone to pretty much pinning or pegging every one of my rods that I'm fishing. Again, we still do the check of rod after rod after rod clearing grass, especially if you drive through a ton of it and you can see it. But what this does is I can pull this up literally, and most of the time, most of the grass that I've encountered is hanging on this peg. And I don't have to worry about getting it out of all my swivels, all my clips, all this stuff here. Once it gets balled up in there, it's a little more work. If you're on top of your gear and you're doing your rotation, as Barnum stated, you can literally pull these up, take the salad bar off of your peg, toss it to the side, check your bait, drop it back down the water, make sure it's spinning good, isn't torn, and is a good looking bait on a drill bit, drop that sucker back down and get to fishing. So it's all about keeping your gear clean. And anything you can do that aids you in getting it cleaned quickly and back in the water, then you're back fishing.
That's the Willapa. Fish a good bait, fish a bright flasher, and stay out of the grass and keep the grass off the line. The peg's gonna work really good because there's a lot of times where I'll reel in, we'll only have 1 or 2 blades of grass, maybe hanging from the flasher or hanging from the bait, where that would have been picked up by the peg. So, I mean, it's a great tactics. Like I said, hit those channel edges, focus on that 18 to 26, 24 feet of water and bounce those bottoms. Slow your troll speed down a little bit. I like to troll at a little slower speed. Slow it down a little bit, let those flashers work. Let them do their job. They're really aggressive kings out there, and they bite really well. And one thing I've noticed on Willapa compared to like the buoy 10 fishery is you don't get the number of short bites. Normally when those fish come up, they're committed to it.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So,
all right, well, that is pretty much going to do it for us in here. Did you look at the show sheet, see what we got going on next?
No, I didn't.
I think we got Austin Mosier
We do have Austin.
we do have Austin Mosier.
Yep.
So we're going to jump out for a break. We come back. We're going to be back in studio. Get Austin Boom Pal Mosier on the phone for our Buoy 10 update. Fishing's been off and on. Today it sounded like it was more so on, and got some great crabbing accomplished as well.
Great
Double
pictures.
bonus day for him. So we'll jump out for a break. We come back. Austin Mosier right here on FHM.